My name is Paul Holdengraber, and I'm the Director of Public Programs at the New York Public Library. As all of you know, my goal here is to make the lions roar, though with Jay-Z recently we made them rap. It is a great pleasure to welcome back to this stage Zadie Smith, who is the author of 3 critically acclaimed novels, White Teeth, The Autograph Man, and On Beauty. Last year she published Changing My Mind, Occasional Essays, which is in part the pretext for having her here. Parts of this book appeared in The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, and The Guardian, as well as on this very stage in 2008, she presented the Robert Silvers Lecture, which was called Speaking in Tongues 2 years ago. Zadie Smith is a professor of creative writing at NYU, and earlier this month she was honored at the New York Public Library as a Library Lion. I would like all of you to become members of the New York Public Library tonight. It's a great, wonderful deal. For just $40 a year, you will get discounts on all of the programs that's the upcoming year, because we are nearly ending our season. It's been a very intense season, from everything from Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer to Keith Richards to Jay-Z to Zadie Smith tonight, to finishing the year with a tribute to the National Lampoon. And we begin the season early in January with a tribute to Gypsy Rose Lee. So we'll have an evening of burlesque. The New York Public Library, in fact, has the archives of Gypsy Rose Lee. So that might be quite an interesting evening to experience. What you may not know about Zadie Smith, I read the biography a bit earlier, but you may not know that from the age of 5 to 15, Zadie Smith wanted to be a musical movie star actress. She states, I tap danced for 10 years before I began to understand people don't make musicals anymore. All I wanted to be was an MGM actress working for Arthur Freed or Gene Kelly or Vincent Minnelli. I love this, historical and geographical constraints made this impossible. Slowly but surely, the pen became mightier than the double pickup time step with shuffle. Please welcome Zadie Smith, who will be reading to you.
I'm just going to read a little bit from the book of essays. It's always hard reading from a book of essays. There's not many obvious, entertaining options. And I'm always aware, I think of something Graham Greene said, that spending a lot of time with writers, if you're a writer, is a kind of masturbation. And reading about writing, if you're a writer, it comes under the same category, I think. So I'm just going to do a little bit of it. This is from an essay called That Crafty Feeling, and it's just about what it feels like to write a novel. It's in 10 parts, and I'm just going to read from 4 till the end. 4. Middle of the novel, magical thinking. In the middle of a novel, a kind of magical thinking takes over. To clarify, the middle of the novel may not happen in the actual geographical center of the novel. By middle of the novel, I mean whatever page you're on when you stop being part of your household and your family and your partner and children and food shopping and dog feeding and reading the Post. I mean when there's nothing in the world except your book. Even as your wife tells you she's sleeping with your brother, her face is a gigantic semicolon, her arms a parenthesis, and you're wondering whether rummage is a better verb than rifle. The middle of a novel is a state of mind. Strange things happen in it. Time collapses. You sit down to write at 9 a.m., you blink, the evening news is on, and 4,000 words are written, more words than you wrote in 3 long months a year ago. Something has changed. And it's not restricted to the house. If you go outside, everything, I mean everything, flows freely into your novel. Someone on the bus says something, it's straight out of your novel. You open the paper. Every single story in the paper is directly relevant to your novel. If you're fortunate enough to have someone waiting to publish your novel, this is the point at which you phone them in a panic and try to get your publication date moved forward, because you can't believe how in tune the world is with your unpublished novel right now. And if it isn't published next Tuesday, maybe the moment will pass and you'll have to kill yourself. Magical thinking makes you crazy and renders everything possible. Incredibly knotty problems of structure now resolve themselves with inspired ease. See that one paragraph? It only needs to be moved and the whole chapter falls into place. But why didn't you see it before? You randomly pick a poetry book off the shelf and the first line you read ends up being your epigraph. It seems to have been written for no other reason. 5. Dismantling the scaffolding. When building a novel, you'll use a lot of scaffolding. Some of this is necessary to hold the thing up, but most isn't. The majority of it is only there to make you feel secure, and in fact, the building will stand without it. Each time I've written a long piece of fiction, I felt this need for an enormous amount of scaffolding. With me, scaffolding comes in many forms. The only way to write this novel is to divide it into 3 sections of 10 chapters each, or 5 sections of 7 chapters. Or the answer is to read the Old Testament and model each chapter on the books of the prophets, or the divisions of the Bhagavad Gita, or the Psalms, or Ulysses, or the songs of Public Enemy, or the films of Grace Kelly, or the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, or the liner notes to the White Album, or the 27 speeches Donald Rumsfeld gave to the press corps during his tenure. Scaffolding holds up confidence when you have none, reduces the despair, creates a goal, however artificial, an end point. Use it to divide what seems like an endless, unmarked journey, though by doing this, like Zeno, you infinitely extend the distance you need to go. Later, when the book is printed and old and dog-eared, it occurs to me that I really didn't need any of that scaffolding. The book would have been far better off without it. But when I was putting it up, it felt vital, and once it was there, I worked so hard to get it there, I was loath to take it down. If you're writing a novel at the moment and putting up scaffolding, well, I hope it helps you. But don't forget to dismantle it later. Or if you're determined to leave it up, out there for all to see, at least hang a nice facade over it, as the Romans do when they fix up their palazzi. 6. The first 20 pages, redux. Because I talk about the first 20 pages earlier on. Late in the novel, in the last quarter, when I'm rolling downhill, I turn back to read those first 20 pages. They're packed tighter than tuna in a can. Calmly, I take off the top, let a little air in. What's amusing about the first 20 pages, they're funny now. 3 years later, now I'm no longer locked up in them. It's how little confidence you have in your readers when you begin. You spoon-feed them everything. You can't let a character walk across the room without giving her backstory as she goes. You don't trust the reader to have a little patience, a little intelligence. This reader, who, for all you know, has read Thomas Bernhard, Finnegan's Wake, Gertrude Stein, George Perec. Yet you're worried that if you don't mention in the first 3 pages that Sarah Malone is a social worker with a dead father, this talented reader might not be able to follow you exactly. It's awful, the swing of the literary fraudulence pendulum. From moment to moment, you can't decide whether you're the fraudulent idiot or your reader is the fraudulent idiot. For writers who work with character a good deal, going back to those first 20 pages is also a lesson in how much more delicate a thing character is than you think it is when you're writing it. The idea of forming people out of grammatical clauses seems so fantastical at the start that you hide your terror in a smokescreen of elaborate sentence-making, as if character can be drawn forcibly out of the curlicues of certain adjectives piled ruthlessly on top of one another. In fact, character occurs with the lightest of brushstrokes. Naturally, it can be destroyed lightly too. I think of a creature called Odradek, who at first glance appears to be a flat, star-shaped spool for thread, but who is not quite this. Odradek, who won't stop rolling down the stairs, trailing string behind him, who has a laugh that sounds as if it has no lungs behind it, a laugh like rustling leaves. You can find the inimitable Odradek in a 1-page story of Kafka's called The Cares of a Family Man. Curious Odradek is more memorable to me than characters I spent 3 years on and 500 pages. 7. The Last Day. There's one great advantage to being a micromanager rather than a macro planner. The last day of your novel truly is the last day. If you edit as you go along, there are no first, second, third drafts. There's only one draft, and when it's done, it's done. Who can find anything bad to say about the last day of a novel? It's a feeling of happiness that knocks me clean out of adjectives. I think sometimes that the best reason for writing novels is to experience those 4.5 hours after you write the final word. The last time it happened to me, I uncorked a good Sancerre I'd been keeping and drank it standing up with the bottle in my hand. And then I lay down in my backyard on the paving stones and stayed there for a long time, crying. It was sunny, late autumn, and there were apples everywhere, overripe and stinky. 8. Step away from the vehicle. You can ignore everything else in this lecture except number 8. It's the only absolutely 24-carat gold-plated piece of advice I have to give you. I've never taken it myself, though one day I hope to. The advice is as follows. When you finish your novel, if money is not a desperate priority, if you don't need to sell it at once or for it to be published that very second, put it in a drawer. For as long as you can manage. A year or more is ideal, but even 3 months will do. Step away from the vehicle. The secret to editing your work is simple. You need to become its reader instead of its writer. I can't tell you how many times I've sat backstage with a line of novelists at some festival, all of us with red pens in hand, frantically editing our published novels into fit form so that we might go on stage and read from them. It's an unfortunate thing, but it turns out the perfect state of mind to edit your own novel is 2 years after it's published, 10 minutes before you go on stage at a literary festival. At that moment, every redundant phrase, each show-off, pointless metaphor, all the pieces of deadwood, stupidity, vanity, and tedium are distressingly obvious to you. 2 years earlier, when the proofs came, you looked at the same pages and couldn't see a comma out of place. And by the way, that's true of the professional editors too. After they've read a manuscript multiple times, they stop being able to see it. You need a certain head on your shoulders to edit a novel, and it's not the head of a writer in the thick of it, nor the head of a professional editor who's seen it 12 different versions. It's the head of a smart stranger who picks it up off a bookshelf and begins to read. You need to get the head of that smart stranger somehow. You need to forget you ever wrote that book. 9. The unbearable cruelty of proofs. Proofs are so cruel, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Proofs are the wasteland where the dream of your novel dies and cold reality asserts itself. When I look at loose-leaf proofs fresh out the envelope, bound with a thick elastic band, marked up by a conscientious copy editor, I feel quite sure I would have to become a different person entirely to do the work that needs to be done here, to correct what needs correcting, fix what needs to be fixed. The only proper response to an envelope full of marked-up pages is give it back to me, let me start again. But no one says this because by this point exhaustion has set in. It's not the book you hope for, maybe something might yet be done, but the will is gone. There's simply no more will to be had. That's why proofs are so cruel, so sad. The existence of the proof itself is proof that it's already too late. I've only ever seen one happy proof in King's College Library, the manuscript of Eliot's The Wasteland. Eliot, upon reaching his own point of exhaustion, had the extreme good fortune to meet Ezra Pound, a very smart stranger, and with his red pen, Ezra went to work. And what work? His pen goes everywhere, trimming, cutting, slicing, a frenzy of editing. The why and wherefore, not especially obvious, at times indeed almost ridiculous, almost at times indiscriminate. Whole pages struck out with a single line. Underneath Pound's marking, The Wasteland is a sad proof like any other, too long, full of lines not worth keeping, badly structured. Lucky Eliot to have Ezra Pound. Lucky Fitzgerald to have Maxwell Perkins. Lucky Carver, we now know, to have Gordon Lish. Where have all the smart strangers gone? 10 years later, nausea, surprise, and feeling okay. I find it very hard to read my books after they're published. I've never read White Teeth. 5 years ago I tried. I got about 10 sentences in before I was overwhelmed with nausea. More recently, when people tell me they've just read that book, I do try to feel pleased. But it's a distant, disconnected sensation, like when someone tells you they met your second cousin in a bar in Goa. I suspect White Teeth and I may never be reconciled. I think that's simply what happens when you begin writing a book at the age of 21. Then, a while ago, I was in an airport somewhere and I saw a copy of The Autograph Man, and on a whim I bought it. On the plane, I had to drink 2 of those mini bottles of wine before I had the stomach to begin. I didn't manage the whole thing, but I read about 2/3, and at that incredible speed with which you can read a book if you happen to have written it. And it was actually not such a bad experience. I laughed a few times, I groaned more than I laughed, and I gave up when the wine wore off, but for the first time, I felt something other than nausea. I felt surprise. The book was genuinely strange to me. There were whole pages I didn't recognize. I didn't remember writing. And because it was so strange, I didn't feel any particular animosity towards it. So that was that. Between that book and me, there now exists a sort of blank truce, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Finally, while writing this lecture, I picked up on beauty. I read maybe 1/3 of it, not consecutively, but chapters here and there. As usual, the nausea, as usual, the feeling of fraudulence, and the too late desire to wield the red pen all over the place. But something else too, something new. Here and there, in very isolated pockets, I had the sense that this line, that paragraph, these were exactly what I meant to write. And the fact was I'd written them and I felt okay about it, felt good even. It's a feeling I recommend to all of you. I was talking to writing students. That feeling feels okay. Thanks.
You wrote that piece for writing students, and you were trying to be helpful to them.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I was.
Well, how did you want to try and help them?
I guess when I'm talking about writing with writing students, I just want to demystify the process.
Why?
Because I find it so unhelpful to have it thoroughly mystified. I remember when I was wanting to write, sometimes I go and hear a writer speak and they'd say something like, I wake up at 6 a.m., I go for a 4-mile run, I stand on my head, all this kind of supposed essential ritual, and that's not my experience of work. Mine is much more chaotic and not very organized, and I'm always learning on the job. I don't feel like an expert in that sense.
Learning on the job in some ways a nice way for us to enter the realm of these essays. I particularly like the quotation you have at the beginning, which I think in some way can lead us into speaking about the book as a whole, by David Foster Wallace. You get to decide what to worship. In some way, this book is precisely the decision of what you get to decide to worship.
What struck me about that quote by David is that for a certain kind of reader, that quote is like a epigraph of relativism. It doesn't matter what you worship. If you can worship anything, then life is easy. You pick and choose like some bad New York Buddhist or something. I think that's how people read
New
it.
York.
Yeah, but from David's practice, I would take that to be a very serious commitment. You do get to decide to worship, but that also means you have to decide carefully, work hard, and you have to make choices that are genuinely meaningful to you. I don't think it's a kind of a simple thing to do. So in this case, the book, I just wanted it to be a record of the things, I guess, that I have loved. In that
it has an elegiac quality.
Yeah,
the book really,
that's
it has an elegiac quality. The way, indeed, you're not becoming a tap dancer has an elegiac quality. Namely, you left that world because it was no longer available.
Just for me, I'm sure it's true for most people, I have to keep on moving. And the books that I loved as a child, which I think are represented here, a certain kind of British canon, I suppose, that was important to me because when I was young, I was trying to make some kind of point that these books were for me too. But then I guess once I'd established they were for me too, then I found there were other places I wanted to go.
You say somewhere that most of the books we read, actually, we read between the age of 11 and 14 or 11 and 17.
I mean, actually, that's Nabokov's idea, and I find it to be true. He suggested that he'd read an enormous amount between the age of about 9 and 15. And that reading, in one sense, that reading, I think, forms you. Like, I can't get rid of the fact that my foundational texts are people like George Eliot and Virginia Woolf rather than, I don't know, Camus and, I don't know, another million miles away. I have to deal with the foundational texts I have. But I also think that you can stay agile as you get older. You can still try and read out of your comfort zone. You can keep moving. But you can't replace that foundational thing.
You can't replace it, but it changes. It changes dramatically. And one of the things that I'm becoming more and more obsessed by, which I found to be a common obsession in some way, is the relationship between taste and aging.
Yeah, I wrote a little bit about that in the book. A good example for me is the book Middlemarch, which Woolf pointed out first that when you're a young woman reading that book, you tend to relate very strongly to Dorothea and think of her as a heroine. And the older you get, the more absurd she seems. You know, she's a completely over-the-top drama queen who makes terrible decisions for 600 pages. But at 15, I didn't see that. I found all her almost obsessive sense of commitment and her self-flagellation and her religious feeling all very admirable. And as I've got older, the people in that book who are more pragmatic, who aren't so obsessive, are much more attractive to me. I think I find obsessive people much more frightening now. When I was 15, probably I was one of them.
But
That's the difference.
But you're attracted to some obsessive characters. I'm thinking in particular, a passion we share is a passion for Werner Herzog. You mention you have a small, because you have these reviews you, I think, used to do or continue to do.
Yeah, no, I used to.
Do you still do them?
No, not much. I would like to. I like movie reviewing. It's fun.
Reviewing movies in particular. But Herzog, Grizzly Man was a film you I think, enjoyed.
Yeah, no, I love Herzog. It's something to do. My favorite is Little Dieter Needs to Fly. You know, absolute classic. But the idea of people in states of extremity and people who make their own lives difficult on a principle, I guess. And it's another example of you choose what to worship. Some people choose to worship things which make their lives impossible. And that fact I find really fascinating.
Well, with Herzog, I remember asking him once why he believed that a filmmaker needed to know how to pick a lock. And he said, because filmmaking is about trespassing. I also recall when my little boy learned to, on a summer vacation, milk the cow. Herzog called me up to say, that is of monumental importance. A boy needs to know how to pull the udder.
Yeah.
And I thought he was maybe mentioning the other, but it was the udder. Going back to kind of an essential quality.
No, I like that about him. It's something about Herzog himself as well, that he has a complete lack of ambivalence. And ambivalence is kind of the normal state of most of us as late moderns. But Herzog, he's got that wonderful short film where he made a bet with someone, and he said if he lost it, he would eat his own shoe. And he did lose the bet, and he ate his own shoe on film. He cooked it and cut it up and ate it. And that kind of monomania, I guess...
You're attracted to characters
I'm
like
attracted
that.
to it. It's not my personality at all, but I suppose I kind of... Something about it, and the characters in my book, quite often there's one or two types like that. I'm just interested in it because I find it very hard to have strong feelings of that kind. I guess that's what it is.
Say something more about that.
I don't. I mean, I tried in the book. I tried to work it out a little bit. It's possible that I grew up in a state of ambivalence, which is maybe something to do with being mixed race or living between two things that other people take to be extreme essences. You know, if you're part of both, the essential nature of those two things isn't obvious to you, because yourself, you're an admixture. That
And
might be it.
is that ambivalence well expressed theoretically, one might say, by the great tension which exists between Roland Barthes and Nabokov? You have that essay where you create a tension.
Yeah, I think I quite often do that in my essays.
Yeah, I don't know if you create it or it's there, but you take the most formalist of Barthes and the most hot-blooded of Nabokov, the Nabokov who says that a novel and a work of art needs to give you a tingle in your spine. And for Barthes, the Barthes that you love quoting at that moment, there's another Barthes which we'll come to. The Barthes that you love to quote, there's a Barthes that is a formalist and rather doesn't believe really that the author as such is important, but the text is.
I think when you're absolutely right, I chose a particular part of Barthes, because Barthes is actually a much more expansive and generous critic than that essay allows. But what I was trying to write about is a feeling that I think is quite common in students of writing and people who care about literature. It was a feeling I had in myself, and I extrapolated wider, which is, I guess, what I generally do. But if you go through learning the theory of literature and you have some ambition or some wish to be a writer, you find yourself in a great deal of conflict, I think. You're not sure... for instance, reading Foucault for the first time, I really took that as a kind of j'accuse. You know, I was being accused of wanting to be the producer of all meaning. You know, that's what you're being accused of. And as a writer, you have to confess that you do want to produce meaning. At the same time, to write, a certain amount of humility is necessary. It's a strange balance between saying, I think that I have something to say here, I have something to write, which I think my students, they want to be able to say that, but at the same time they fear that as a oppressive statement. You know, who are you to go around writing things?
Do you read academic critiques of your books?
No, never. My God, no. No. That would be a masturbation on a whole other level. It's bad enough as it is. No.
Someone who's absent from this book, who I was longing to find, is Italo Calvino. Calvino has a line, a paragraph which I'd like to read to you, and I'd love you to respond to it. A girl came to see me who is writing a thesis on my novels for a very important university seminar in literary studies. I see that my work serves her perfectly to demonstrate her theories, and this is certainly a positive fact. For the novels or the theory, I do not know which. From her very detailed talk, I got the idea of a piece of work being seriously pursued, but by my books, scenes through her eyes, prove unrecognizable to me. I'm sure that this Lotaria, that is her name, has read them conscientiously, but I believe she has read them only to find in them what she already is convinced, what she already convinced of before reading them. I tried to say this to her. She retorted, a bit irritated. Why? Would you want me to read in your books only what you're convinced of? I answered her, that isn't it. I expect readers to read in my books something I didn't know, but I can expect it only from those who expect to read something they didn't know.
That's a very subtle version of the argument. I think the great thing about that Calvino quote is that it doesn't set up an argument between two different ways of reading, because there needn't really be a row. I mean, for me, when I'm teaching, I'm trying to encourage the separate spheres, because for me that kind of academic criticism of a novel is absolutely viable and enjoyable. But the thing to remember about it is it's an art in itself, and a beautiful art, but I also want to keep a little place in the university, a small spot, where students also feel free to say things which are emotive, expressive, not particularly academic, to express that little response to novels that we all have. It's not that you can't use a novel to prove the sex life of Germans at the turn of the century or feminist Moors in Iran or any other arguments that novels are used for. That's a productive use of novels, but there should be some corner of university where a student feels free also to say, I love it. I love this book.
And do you find that a difficult thing to come by in the university? Do students feel bashful to express such emotions?
I think it's different now. When I was in college, I was in an English degree exclusively, whereas a lot of my students, I guess, are in creative writing and in English. And I did feel that my affective experience in front of a novel was not really for discussion. That wasn't really what we were there for.
It was beside the point.
It was beside the point, and also, I mean, we were a class of maybe 18, and I'm sure many of us wanted to write novels, but it was never something you would confess in public. It was like considered something of a sin. And it's so different from the American model where everyone you meet is constantly going on about how they're going to write a novel. But for me, it was not. When I finally told my professor at the end of my course, you know, he was not impressed by that revelation. That was something to be slightly ashamed of, I think. And so I don't think that's a bad habit. It's a different way of creating writers. The experience I went through believes that you make writers by reading, and that's what you do. And you read everything.
Yeah, and you speak about this appetite for reading. It's as if you can't really stop. Reading, you cannot write, but you cannot not read. Reading for you is like a third lung. It's something that you must do at every particular moment, especially during your daytime. It sounds like most of your time is taken by reading.
That's my whole life. Yeah, I don't. I don't know if I think it's true for other writers too. That some people have writing as a compulsion. I don't have that. I mean, I admire the writers who have it, who feel the desperate need to write every day, but that's not my compulsion. Reading, on the other hand, I think we said just before we came on, when I recently had a baby, and at a certain point in the baby's development, my husband said, you know, you've got to speak to her. She's never going to learn to speak. If you're always reading while breastfeeding or whatever, she's going to be a mute. I was like, oh yeah, good point.
No, but what but what you are instilling in her is the sound of pages being turned.
Yes. It's a psychological horror when she goes into therapy 20 years from now.
Yeah, I know. It's tremendous now. One thinks of that. $5 every day is what you need to put aside for the future therapy. Yeah. This is what I'm saving up at this moment. But one of the important characteristics of reading for you is that, and reading with a kind of passion that this book tries to inspire in the readers to have for novels they are reading, is that reading no longer does to you what reading did to you when you were much younger, which is isolate you. So in some way, you are trying, it's also an elegiac book in the sense that you're trying to create a community in some way, where reading once upon a time seemed to be such a solitary endeavor.
For me it was solitary, but it's also person-making, which is something which fades over time. Like now I can read a wonderful book, but I'm just too old for it to have the kind of impression on me that it would have had when I was 14, 15. You can take little things as stylistic things from new great writers that you enjoy, but they're not going to get into your kind of literary DNA, the way that people you read when you were young.
Is that sad?
For me it's sad because I like to be influenced and I like to be transformed. And sometimes a voice is so strong. Think of an example, George Saunders for me is a good example, that an adult writer can read him and really feel the pressure of his style, because it's just so particular and so brilliantly done. And it can create very bad results. I think for a long time, I'd never published any of them, but for about a year after I read George, I was just imitating him, constantly, because his influence was so so strong. But that's rare, and I think might even be the definition of a genius when you come across writing that has the power to do that to you so late in the day.
You call it creative thievery.
Yeah, it's really, that's extraordinary when that happens. But mostly I just wanted to encourage and defend an idea of reading which is absolutely passionate and engaged. There's a kind of trend, maybe it's just me, but I keep on reading in essays by various people. There's usually a little section where someone will say, oh, you know, I looked at that book, I didn't even bother reading it. I could tell what was in it, or I could tell what it was about, or I'd read the press about it. And I know that that's meant to be like the last sign of hipster sophistication, that you're so well, you don't even have to read the book to know what's in it. But for me, it's a kind of like, it's like a fetishization of Philistinism. And I just find it unbelievable. That's become a kind of sign of aesthetic sophistication, that you needn't even read something to know how bad it is. That's kind of shocking to me. So I'm just trying to reinforce the idea that there's no replacement for the actual reading. You can read all the press, you can look at the photo on the back, you can talk about it with your friends at a dinner party, you can do all that. But you have to read the damn book, because it's a going through. It's not just something that happens on the outside. It's a process you go through.
The English psychoanalyst once said that the goal and role of the mother was was for the child to be alone in the presence of the mother, which seems to me like an extraordinary description of reading, namely that you're alone but deeply nurtured.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room who are the same way. If I go out for a short coffee break and I know I'm meeting a friend, I have 4 books in my bag. Why do I have 4 books in my bag? It's coffee with a friend. At most, she might be 5 minutes late, but it's not going to be time to read 4 books. But you notice...
Unless she's very
late. Very late.
Yeah.
But I always notice that about writers too, that if you ever happen to meet a writer for lunch, if you're late, they're delighted. I'm always happy when someone's late, apart from Jeff Dyer. He hates lateness of all kinds. But every other writer, you're happy for that 20 minutes where you get a chance to read something. And all of time is measured in how long have you got to read. It's ridiculous. But that kind of... yeah, I'm rarely lonely for that reason, I guess, because I always have books with me. But writing, by contrast, I find a very isolating and sad activity. Then it is just you.
The building, you were saying about reading that it's a building in some way of a persona and of a person and of a self. And I read with passion, which I imagine many people have read, your recent piece on the new movie. Probably all of you saw it, The Social Network, in the most current issue, or the issue before the most current issue of the New York Review of Books. First of all, why did you review this movie?
Normally, I have no time for doing any spare work. I've got a kid, I've got to teach. And,
why this movie?
And Bob Silver's the editor of the New York Review, sometimes sends me things, would you like to do this or that? And normally I just say no, because there's no time, and I can't afford to do it. But something, I don't know why. That's the thing which interests me. When he sent that through and said, do you want to review this movie? I found that I said yes, and I wondered why it interested me. And I think, for me, when I'm writing an essay, I'm not writing from a position of an expert. What you're watching, which I'm sure is perfectly obvious if you read them, is somebody learning about the thing as they're writing it. So something about that subject I just wanted to know. I knew I had had a feeling when I was on Facebook, and I couldn't really describe it. And I knew it was a way of finding out what that feeling was.
What worries you most about Facebook?
I don't think Facebook is the end of the world. And, a lot of it was a playful piece. But I did think, and after I wrote the piece, I got a lot of mail from people. And it made me think, there's nothing at all original in that piece. I was talking about a feeling that I had a guess a lot of people had, and it turned out that was correct. It's not, some people write essays where they're giving you, a view from beyond. What I'm trying to do is articulate as well I can with my talent, which is just about making sentences sound okay, just to express what a lot of people felt, what I had a gut feeling perhaps they felt, because I felt it. And then your little jump you make is, well, I'm not a total freak, am I? Somebody else must feel this. And once you've made that assumption, then you kind of go forward. And I emailed my students, I emailed my friends and family, and just said, well, how do you feel when you're on this thing? What does it feel for you to be on? And then I was extremely lucky in having lunch with another writer who just read this Jaron Lanier book and put it in front of me, and so then all the dots start to connect. But for me, it's always about just, again, thinking about Wallace, just because he was on my mind when I was writing it. It's just, he seemed to me to have a basic idea that human beings are sacred. And that can be a massively conservative position to go from. And I was very aware when I was writing the piece that it's going to come across as technophobia, and I'm not brilliant on the internet. There's a lot of it I don't understand. But I'm always interested in, is there a way to stick with that idea that human beings are sacred, that there is something sacred about them, which I do believe? Is there a way to take that belief and not go into the first and easiest conservative position, to try and push yourself and consider, is it possible that human beings are sacred and they can exist on the internet? And I absolutely think that's true. And what's great about the Lanier is that he is a real internet visionary. He's really interested in how we can have exciting, fulfilling lives on the internet, which I think is totally possible. But my feeling was that just this particular format is not that fulfilling. That was the only point I wanted to make. And it doesn't allow for this idea that human beings aren't just flat pieces of data, that they're a little more than that.
But your piece is a little more critical than you make it sound now. Am I right? Shall I read the last passage? I mean, just to give people a sense of what, in fact, you're saying at the very end. Maybe just the last two paragraphs. The last defense of every Facebook addict is, but it helps me keep in contact with people who are far away. Well, email and Skype do that too, and they have the added advantage of not forcing you to interface with the mind of Mark Zuckerberg. But well, we all know, if we really wanted to write to these faraway people or see them, we would. What we actually want to do is the bare minimum. Just like any 19-year-old college boy would rather be doing something else or nothing. At my screening, when a character in the film mentioned the early blog platform LiveJournal, still popular in Russia, the audience laughed. I can't imagine life without files, but I can just about imagine a time when Facebook will seem as comically obsolete as LiveJournal. In this sense, a social network is not a cruel portrait of any particular real-world person called Mark Zuckerberg. It is a cruel portrait of us, 500 million sentient people entrapped in the recent careless thoughts of a Harvard sophomore.
Well, that's the thing which blows my mind, 500 million people. I think that's what the Lanier book is so interesting about. It's just the scale of the thing. Any other revolution that took place with so many people in so little time would have a philosophy, a period of thought, a period of discussion, an argument. But the internet revolution has happened like that.
So quickly.
And most of us have just fallen into it without
and
serious
have become
consideration.
Addicts. Become addicts. I mean,
in
truly.
the past 2 years, no one in this room can deny it, walking down streets in New York, every day, 3 or 4 people walk into me.
I mean,
It's
everybody...
like, if you were from a different planet, you would say it looked like a zombie race, like this.
Everybody is davening. I mean, it really feels that way.
And so that just needs to be thought about. It's not that it needs to end, but it needs to be thought about.
But what is lost? Because I am curious about this. I am curious, and I want to push you in that direction because I'd like you to think what I'm thinking, which is that... and then we'll get to changing my mind. But what strikes me, I went to see the film yesterday, and it's, as you say in your fine review, it is a very well-made film with extremely good, I mean, the acting, I would say, is perfect, and the way it is cast is perfect. But the subject matter, the paucity of, of experience,
But I think the subject's quite interesting. I think it's interesting about people who perhaps have a positive experience. But, you know, with all these things, the problem is that you can't go backwards. Like, you can write as many articles about the internet revolution as you like. You can't turn the thing backwards, and that truly is a conservative position. There's no putting the cat back in the bag. That's not going to happen. But it might be that we can think a bit more carefully about where we're going next. And to me, if you ask what's lost, it's just a very simple thing. It's something about being relational rather than performative. The weird thing about Facebook is that everybody on it is like their own mini celebrity. That's what it turns you into. You have fans, you're constantly giving them updates, you're like a little celebrity, and the relation, no matter what anyone says, is pretty much one way. And then you are voyeuristic about other people's celebrity profiles and how many friends they have. And it's an idea of being human which is one way. And real life is relational. You have to deal with other people. You have to have some kind of relationship with them. And you can't just perform yourself. You have to look at them, you have to look them in the eye, which has become increasingly difficult for younger people. Quite often I have a cousin who looks like this all the time. But on the internet, you know, it's all self-revelation.
So it creates a sense, a feeling or a sense of intimacy without the necessity for it.
I think that's true, but I also think, and I wanted to try and say in the piece, that you don't need to have a kind of, oh God, where are we going to reaction, because young people will always find their way out of these things. No generation is more foolish than the one that came before. They'll always find creative ways to work themselves out of this situation. And you can already see it happening. There are already artists on the net, all kinds of radicals on the net. They'll find some way. And in fact, the more culpable, and I don't know if I made this clear in the piece, are not the kids who went on Facebook, but all the adults. It was the adults who didn't even, it behooved them to sit back and think for a minute and question, what is this platform, what is it doing? But they felt like, you know, girls fainting in a puddle over this stuff. They all went on Twitter, they all went on Facebook. It was the adults who really fell for it. What the kids do will be more interesting. We'll see.
I'm struck by the title of your book, Changing My Mind. How does one change one's mind? Because it's something I think that people don't do very often. And they certainly don't speak about it with such relish as you do. It seems that so often we're stuck in thinking what we think and don't want to change our mind.
You know, it definitely, everyone will, I'm sure, feel this. It gets harder as you get older, as your positions become entrenched and your relationships become entrenched. It's not so easy to flit around. But I guess just for me personally, when I look at my life, you know, I have a pretty staid life. I'm married, I teach. I'm not no kind of Bukowski or Hemingway running around the world having wild experiences. So it kind of, the place where I try and be free is in my reading. It would kill me if not only this part of my life is so staid that also in my reading I shut down, you know? Then there would be no hope. And I think also for a writer who has come out of books, and many writers don't. Some writers come from experience, some writers come from trauma. There's all different kinds of writers. But I obviously am a writer who came out of other books. So my whole arena, the way I can move forward is through reading creatively. So this book, for me, was just a record of what I have read, and to be honest, what I don't intend to read any more of, because I need to go elsewhere.
You need to go elsewhere, and one of the impressions one gets when reading this book is that this book is a farewell in some way to many of the earlier passions, and also an acknowledgement of some new desires. Maybe one of them might be rap music.
That's an old one. Gifted from my family.
Because of your two brothers.
Yeah, I guess maybe. Yeah, I guess they started it. I mean, I think I gave them good soul music, and then they came up beneath me with hip hop. Yeah, that's probably true.
And now you're reading a lot of graphic novels.
Yeah, I've been reading only for about a decade. Not like, you know, proper comic heads who start when they're very small and never stop. But I love graphic novels. It kept on striking me in the past decade when people asked you for your books of the year or your best books. When I was honest with myself, it was graphic novels that were so frequently the answer. It just seemed to be so much genuine imagination on display. You know, even if you just buy those Best American collections that come out every year in America, the breadth of styles and risk-taking, and it just really struck me that something exciting was going on there.
There's a passage I love of Nabokov, which I'd like to read to you, which in some way I think may be in communication with the social network, and it's the difference between the social network and the way Nabokov sees reality. Reality is a very subjective affair. I can only define it as a kind of gradual accumulation of information and as specialization. If we take a lily, for instance, or any other kind of natural object, a lily is more real to a naturalist than it is to an ordinary person. But it is still more real to a botanist, and yet another stage of reality is reached with that botanist who is a specialist in lilies. You can get nearer and nearer, so to speak, to reality, but you never get near enough. Because reality is an infinite succession of steps, levels of perceptions, false bottoms, and hence unquenchable, unattainable. You can know more and more about one thing, but you can never know everything about one thing. It's hopeless.
Of course, he had a better chance than most with all his extreme knowledge.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, so to read like Pale Fire, I always feel such a surge of jealousy, because for most people, for most novelists, the tree is just the tree. But Nabokov is able to look at the tree and the insect on the tree and know the cycle of the insect on the tree. And it's more than just information. Like, anybody who reads Nabokov doesn't feel like he's just an information machine. It's loved detail, you know. He understands it and loves it and sees things which, without that knowledge, you wouldn't even see. He's extremely fortunate, and the most fortunate novelist for that reason. But yes, he's right. I mean, the perfectly obvious example, which always strikes me, I guess, as someone who writes a lot about family, is that if you sit down at this Thanksgiving coming with your family and try and go over any incident from your mutual background, anything, you cannot get 2 yards without a storming row. It becomes really obvious to you that you and your siblings, for instance, have literally lived different realities. I mean, absolutely different realities. Not versions, not different realities. And that just is so amazing to me.
And what is amazing about that from the point of view of being a novelist?
Because whenever I'm writing, you know, you think you have some kind of perspectival authority. You think you know what's going on, and then you're constantly disabused of that. The inability to absolutely fix on the thing and say exactly what happened and how people felt about it is what gives you space to continue, because you know you can't pin that thing down precisely. But the shock of it and the shock of relative experiences of the same incident is very overwhelming to me, because it's also it destabilizes you morally. The things you think you know are right, the right actions you think you made, from somebody else's point of view, are a horror or something that was extremely painful to them. When you're very young, I think you don't know that. You don't realize.
Among the great passions in this book that you describe is your passion for George Eliot. George Eliot is, and Middlemarch in particular, but not only Middlemarch, is a book that is extremely important to you, and extremely important to you, as you said earlier, in the rereading process, in rediscovering it. What is it about George Eliot in particular that is so deeply moving? And I might add that just before coming down here, we showed you some manuscripts of George Eliot, and I felt that the greatest attraction in the reading room in the special collections was to see George Eliot's penmanship.
Yeah, I was actually quite overwhelmed seeing that. The thing about Eliot, it's a lot of my love for her, maybe it's true of a lot of women writers, it's kind of extra literary. I do think the books are astonishing, but it's more the fact of Eliot, her life. If you ever read the biographies, her life was so difficult for so long, and she had a will of iron. What she achieved with her entire self, and it was so hard. She was incredibly ugly, she felt. She was completely unloved. She was totally isolated. She was not educated in university. She's an autodidact par excellence. It's unbelievable. And what we saw upstairs is her research notes for Daniel Deronda, which I don't know if you've read. It has a Jewish theme. And in order to write that book, in which the Jewish theme appears but isn't the whole of the book, she clearly, from the notes upstairs, researched Judaism to the nth degree. She learnt everything. She made notes on everything. And knowing that in the end she would only use small amounts, but she felt she needed, in that Hemingway sense, the whole of the iceberg, even if you only saw the tip. And that kind of work that she did without support, without institutional support, without love, which is extremely important, I think, for writers generally. She came to love late in her life, and then she was able to write more. But so much she did alone in a society which made her, treated her like a pariah. Because in the end, when she found love, she didn't marry, and it's just, to me, it's really extraordinary. And so I don't often think about role models in that sense. But her will is so impressive that when you have no will left, it impresses you.
She would be one.
I can't help it, even though it's the cheesiest choice for any women writers to choose George Eliot. But the scope of her achievement is just mind-boggling to me.
You're particularly interested in many of the essays by the power and virtue of empathy. And George Eliot has a wonderful line, not included in your book, which I'd like to read to you, where she says, the greatest benefit we owe to the artist, whether painter, poet, or novelist, is an extension of our sympathies. Art is a nearer thing to life. It is a mode of amplifying experience and extending our contact with our fellow men beyond the bounds of our personal lot. That was in an introduction she wrote to the history of life in Germany. And then in your book, one of the most exquisite passages from Middlemarch, which I had completely forgotten, but which makes me want to reread the book, is this one. If we had a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heart beat, and we would die of that roar which lies on the other side of silence. As it is, the quickest of us walk about well weighted with stupidity. It's incredible.
It's an incredible quote, but the older I get, the more I feel it can lead to a dangerous conclusion. There is a kind of philosophy of the novel, a kind of religion of the novel, which puts that principle, empathy and the empathetic feeling for strangers or for other people or for animals, at the center of its philosophy. If you could do that, if you understood how another person lived, you would care and do right by them. And that's a very entrancing belief in something that I grew up hoping was true and believing, I suppose. But it can also be a very lazy belief. And there's a story on the front of the New York Times which really struck me. I'm a massive dog lover, but there was a dog recently who performed some heroic action in Afghanistan. I can't remember what kind. But he was brought here and then accidentally euthanized. When he ran away one night, he was euthanized. So I was reading this story with sympathy for the dog, and then I realized you turn the page and there's 2 more pages about the dog and about the vigil for the dog. That's a candlelight vigil, which is going to happen soon. And there you see where this kind of fetishization of our empathy skills, sometimes they go in one place, like the poor dog, and the major part of that story, what's happening in Afghanistan, took up about 3 lines. So there can be a kind of sentimental reaction, and also there's a good piece by Terry Eagleton recently talking about this, that in the end, empathy, it is one of the most useful social glues and one of the most wonderful things for us to behave rightly towards each other, but it's nothing without political systems that function, without a kind of exercise against injustice, which is slightly more active than I read Middlemarch and I felt so for Dorothea. You know, there's a limit to that kind of empathy in action. And I think the novelist should always be aware of that. Like you can fool yourself writing novels that you're saving the world, one by one, opening the hearts of people so they become better. But people's hearts can be opened extensively, and they can do nothing. You have to be careful with that idea.
So you're fighting the kind of meliorist feeling that literature actually makes us better?
I just think that the English tradition of the novel, as represented, the kind of apex of it by Eliot, doesn't always recognize that people are perverse. People are profoundly perverse. The French understand that very well. But the English, they tend not to look at things which are certain parts of human nature they'd rather not think about. And that kind of perversity, I guess, interests me more than it used to.
Can you teach perversity?
No, I think that's a natural, God-given right. Yeah, no help needed.
When you were here 2 years ago, you gave a lecture which is now published in this collection of essays, Speaking in Tongues. And you said that Obama was a man from Dream City. And when you came here, he had just recently gotten elected. And I'm wondering how you see him now, if you still see him negotiating well coming from Dream City, which for you meant belonging to so many different worlds, maybe the different kinds of worlds that you belong to as well.
At the end of that essay, I said what I feel, that basically my thought when I was writing that essay is that you've just elected a novelist to be president, and we'll see how that goes. The argument was on the one side, there are lots of great things about novelists. On the other side, they do tend to have this strong sense of ambivalence, and I think you've seen that in Obama. In that campaign, maybe the ambivalence, as far as I read it, seemed such a relief and so necessary, given that people were screaming at each other so loudly and so absurdly. But I imagine it doesn't function as well in government when, as W would say, you need to make decisions. You have to be the decider. So I don't know. I mean, I still find him, for me, I know when Jay-Z was sitting here last week, it will never stop being an extraordinary fact that there is a black man in the White House. At some very fundamental level, as a black kid growing up, you kind of sublimate a feeling of, I don't know, it's some kind of insecurity or some sense that certain things can't happen. And so when it did happen, I felt that it kind of broke something open in me, and I'm sure a lot of black people felt the same way. And it's not probably a very sensical reaction, because Obama is Obama, he's not me. To feel proud about somebody who you're not related to, who you have nothing personally to do with, but it was a feeling of a kind of relief and pride, which was a lovely experience.
The title of the book comes in part from seeing the Philadelphia Story. Is that correct?
Of this book?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe, yes, slightly. I mean, the Philadelphia Story is in there a lot, but I hadn't thought of the direct connection. But you're right, yeah.
What does the title? What does the title mean?
Well, I guess I saw that film when I was very young, like literally a kid. And in fact, the last time I saw it was right here in Bryant Park.
On the huge screen.
Yeah, on the huge screen, which was just so wonderful. It just struck me, that film's about somebody who is, in her personal life, a kind of militant, and who is made to change. And when I first watched it, I was very offended by the idea that he was a bright, strong, feminist woman who's broken in some way by her father and then the other men in her life and is changed. And I didn't like that. And then it's another case of growing older and watching the same movie and feeling differently. And you realize it's really not about a person being broken down. It's not about a man against a woman. It's really about somebody opening up and realizing that things aren't always black and white, that ambivalences exist, that she isn't always certain. And
the line from the Philadelphia Story is, the time to make up your mind about people is never.
Yeah.
Which I love.
I always loved it as a kid. And I think a lot of it is You know, if you're not a white man, white men have the kind of experience of never being pinned down exactly. They can be what they like, they can do what they like. They're kind of free in the symbolic world. But if you're anything other than a white man, wherever you go, decisions are made about you. What you're capable of, what you do, what you think, what you like. And I was always very aware of that as a child, and I suppose to a certain extent, like looking at this book and the books I picked up as a kid, I was always working against the assumption that I should read a certain kind of book, listen to a certain kind of music. So in a way, I went a long way round to avoid people making decisions about me.
Well, you know,
which is not a free choice, of course. It's a choice made in opposition to something.
The first, I think, in the very first page of The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald says that reserving judgment is a matter of infinite hope.
Yes.
And when you were a child, maybe 11, 12, is that when your mother put in your hand Hurston to read?
Yeah.
She said to you, you must read it.
Yeah.
And she sort of gave it to you, and you rejected it at first.
At first
you
I rejected it because I felt always that I didn't want to be tied naturally to an experience which is it's very different being a black woman in England from being a black woman in America. And the idea that we were sisters just because of skin color, I couldn't understand. And then, of course, I read the book, and I think I loved it more than any book that I'd read up to that point. It was a kind of, it was a transformative book for me. And it was annoying because my mum was really hoping that would happen. So I had to concede her wisdom. And then I read Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, all these extraordinary writers. And I felt that there was some kind of sisterhood, that despite this extraordinary historical difference, which should change so many things, I did still feel something intimate. And it's a very simple thing. It's because they had my hair, they had my skin, they had my looks, they had my experience of the world. And your physical experience of the world is no small thing. You know, it means the way people react to you, the way people respond to you. So for me, it was a real... it was just, as everybody always says, it was just suddenly I saw people like me in these things that I love, books, and it was just wonderful.
And you speak about, in that essay, the first essay of the book, you speak about the physical reaction you had to that book, of being nearly overwhelmed and drowned by it. You read it in one sitting of 3 hours.
I was totally overwhelmed by it. But
was your mother surprised that she had finally gotten through to you?
No, she was very cunning. She knew all the time. She was just lying in wait. It was just... I think the thing which really struck me is that when white people are reading, they're not even aware of this identification. It's so neutral to them. They never think twice. They just think they're reading about humanity, never realizing that humanity is always dressed in their clothes, with their color skin, with their habits, their cars, their lifestyles. And so to read something in which, for once, something that looked like you, felt like you, was humanity, was a thing under discussion, is no small thing. And now when I'm writing, like some of the books I've written on beauty, I think particularly, you know, it's quite an old-fashioned structure. It's kind of a 19th century book, but part of the reason for writing it for me was a kind of sublimated desire to fill the books that I used to read with people I recognize, and hoping that some kids would pick up that book and think, oh, this is, you know, a big book about people and the things they do, but the people aren't all white. For once, they're not all white.
This is the other side of empathy. I mean, you were here the other day when on this stage, Cornel West and myself interviewed Jay-Z. And there was that moment, which I probably will never forget, where Jay-Z basically said, you can't imagine what it was to be me. You can't imagine what it was to be me coming from Marcy Projects, being a 9-year-old kid and seeing my friend shot in front of me.
No, I mean, it's not I don't think it is something you can imagine, but through his music, you can get really close. And that's the most, for me, Jay-Z, I'm sure for a lot of people in the room, you know, is a big hero, because he is able to, particularly the early music, his rap is a way of thinking. That's why it's strange to see him on the stage, because he's a great intellectual in his music. It's hard to describe, but he's thinking through this form called rap, and he thinks extremely eloquently in that form. And then to see him on stage is like a fish out of water, because I want to hear him doing that extraordinary thing he does with his language. But the gap in experience there, to me, and I still feel this, far more than race, is class. What you can't imagine, I think, is being poor like that. And that's the thing that I always, particularly in my own experience from being relatively poor and then not being poor, I see already how you stop being able to remember what that felt like. That is really, really hard, that gap to cross and to contain. And what's fascinating about rap music is it's all about that. It's all about, I used to be in the hood and now I'm no longer in the hood. And does that make me still a rapper or not a rapper? Am I still black or am I not black? Am I still real or am I not real? It's an articulation of that experience of not being working class anymore, which is extremely painful on one hand, because everything that, in Jay-Z's example, everything that's fresh and beautiful and meaningful about his music came from that experience. And he's slowly moving further and further away from it, exactly. So it's a way of trying to talk about that. And what's brilliant about Jay-Z and the rappers like him is that instead of pretending that movement hasn't happened, he recognizes it, he talks about it. Dre is the same way. If you pretend that you're still in the hood 30 years later when you're living in Beverly Hills, some terrible betrayal has happened. But Jay-Z doesn't do that. He discusses the progression and talks about how it feels, what it means not to be that type of gangster anymore, to be this different kind of gangster.
And a different kind of, and he'll say it himself, he has not abandoned at all the hustler mentality in him.
No.
He spoke about it with great eloquence. Now, I think that what happens also is that transformation changes you as a reader. The fact that your own life has changed and that your situation in life has changed the way you read books.
Yeah, I guess I've become wary of, I suppose, a sentimentalization of working class experience. I always find that a bit annoying, maybe more so than when I was younger. I think the principle of hip-hop is a very good principle for literature. The idea of keeping it real, even if the real has transformed, is a good one. You have to be honest to your present experience. And the good thing about that rule is that if you're extremely honest, you will always be extremely weird. That's what I always want to say to my students, that the honest expression of experience is always strange. And it kind of, there's a movie I went to see recently, I don't know if many people have seen it here or love it or hate it, but a movie called Tiny Furniture, which is by a girl who's incredibly entitled, a rich family, all the rest of it. And most kids in that situation, they're trying to make art run a million miles because they're kind of ashamed of where they come from. They think there's nothing there to say. But she managed a way of just being brutally honest about this situation. And that, to me, is a kind of hip-hop spirit. It doesn't matter what the subject is. If you can be honest to that experience and to tell the truths which aren't always pretty and not particularly flattering to yourself, art will find a way. It will kind of squeeze out the situation.
And in some sense, your recent piece about the social network is an investigation of what constitutes reality.
Yes, and that's
you say this,
difficult to measure.
I feel you answered that question by sighing.
Yeah, because I don't know if I guess that's my Nabokov speaking in my head, that reality is a kind of Kant term. There's no such thing as reality in the general sense. There's only a very particular personal reality. And it is up to artists to try and be as accurate as possible to that experience of the world. Like I always say to my writing students, always worrying about their subject. Is the subject not interesting enough? I wish I had more interesting life. But none of that is relevant. The only relevance is to be as accurate as possible. It's not even about churning out autobiography. It's something, I don't know, lying to tell the truth. It's a weird dynamic, but you have to be honest in your practice of it.
I was saying to you a little earlier that you had chosen a part of Barthes, which was the formalist Barthes. But then when you read other books, for instance, his kind of autobiography...
Well, he changed his mind. He was a great example of that.
He changed his mind. But I'm curious about that because you didn't quite answer it. You know, how does one go about changing one's mind? Does one... I mean, what do we need in order to... Because, I mean, in a way, changing one's mind is a way of ensuring that we remain interesting.
I think you have to put
young.
yourself in the way of things you wouldn't normally be in the way of. And to be honest, that's the main reason I teach, is because if you're in a room with 12 people under the age of 25, they're going to force you to read things you don't want to read, to watch films you don't want to watch, to look at things on the internet you don't want to look at. And that's all positive to me. It's just the feeling of being around younger people with different ideas, who challenge your ideas. I need that, particularly in a job like mine where you have very few colleagues. You know, you have writers here and there who you can email, but you don't get a lot of company. And I find my students throw things at me that I have to handle. So that's part of it. You also, I suppose, have to, and I find this very difficult, but you have to keep on trying to. You have to be willing to realize that what you did before isn't very good. You need to see the problems in it in order to change them. The thing which I always have a horror of, and maybe that's why I err too much in the other direction, is when I first started writing and first met writers. I'd never met a writer before in my life. When I was first published, I started meeting all these writers. And every now and then you'd meet someone who would become so defensive and angry about their work and would claim that the worst books they'd ever written were their best books. And I just thought, God, I never want to not know that this was good and this was bad. I never want to lose the judgment of a reader in the ego of a writer.
You don't suffer from that at all, because you can't read yourself.
I'm maybe too extreme at the other end. You can have too much nausea and then not be able to write at all. But I just, having come from the world of readers, I just always wanted to continue that feeling, because I find readers to be good, expansive people, and writers sometimes can close down. You know, you become the defender of your own little backyard of novels, even when you know they're not good, and then you get older, and then they give you awards just for being old, and then it gets worse and worse. And I just didn't. I kind of have a horror of that.
How was it getting this big award at the library, becoming a library lion?
Yeah, it made me feel very old. That was an example. Yeah, it was. The reason I took it, the reason I liked it, was the idea of, for me, it's so surreal to be sitting here, like a girl from Willesden. It's like something from the story of a musical, and to be in New York and to have a life in New York, to be able to write for New York publications, for all of that stuff, to me is extraordinary. You know, I never expected anything like that to happen in my life. So, and then to have some involvement with the library, it was just amazing. So yeah, that's why I took it. And my mum was delighted. She was very pleased.
In Roland Barthes, by Roland Barthes, he has a passage which I love, and which is very different from the Barthes you bring about in your Nabokov versus Barthes, which is j'aime, je n'aime pas. I like, I don't like. And in the like, I like salad, cinnamon, cheese, piment, marzipan, the smell of new cut hay. Why doesn't someone with a nose make such a perfume? Roses, peonies, lavender. And then he goes on. I mean, it's a list. Bouvard et Pécuchet, Sartre, Brecht, Verne, Fourier, Eisenstein. I don't like women in slacks, geraniums, strawberries, a harpsichord, Miro, tautologies, animated cartoons, Arthur Rubinstein, villas.
Villas?
Villas.
It's a bit harsh.
The afternoons, yeah. But here, what interested me, and the reason I'm bringing up this passage, is that changing my mind is most forcefully, in my mind, a book affirming the importance of taste. I mean, taste, which seemed to me such an important thing growing up. I mean, the reason we were friends with people is because they, in some form or another, shared our adjectives.
I know, I love the idea, particularly when you're young, that you're friends with someone because they like the same band as you. It's so inconceivable as you get older and older that would be the thing which joined you. Something I love about teenagers is exactly that kind of seriousness. Like, if you don't like this band, we cannot be friends. But it's a profound thing.
But it is serious.
It's
but where
terrific.
isn't it in your book that you speak about an old boyfriend who you left because
he didn't like Adam's rib. I didn't leave him for that reason, but it didn't help. No, it's true. I think, I mean, that's a beautiful passage of Barth, and the wonderful thing about Barth, and the reason why I think he's a savior to a lot of people who are in those literary theory classes like I was, feeling desperate, is that Barth is the man who's brave enough to say, I like, to bring this aesthetic joy and pleasure, jouissance, as he said, back into the classroom. And I think for him, changing his mind was really a very personal matter. He became this kind of intellectual superstar, and then very quickly realized that you have to then defend your position and do all this tedious stuff that I don't think he was interested in. He was really a lover of objects, a lover of the arts. He wasn't out to be the king's semiologist. That was not his mission. And some of his writing, like A Lover's Discourse, you realize that...
A Lover's Discourse is...
It's exquisite. And the thing
you remember that passage on waiting?
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of my favorite moments.
It's amazing.
He analyzes what it means for a lover to
wait for the other person.
And we feel so tremendously original when we're in love.
Yeah.
But we are really
he
not at all.
Everything. Yeah.
I mean, we are waiting. We're looking at our watch. If
wonderful.
we're waiting too long, we probably will leave, not to be seen waiting. And he goes through it in a way that really makes you actually be in pain for having been so lacking in originality.
That book is just a revelation and that's the thing when we said at the beginning that criticism and the creative arts don't have to be in an argument, because Barth showed that criticism is an art. It's a separate art. It's a beautiful, intelligent, wonderful art. It doesn't have to be the same as the creative arts. It's something different. But he made me have respect for the critic as someone who has absolutely as much genius as his supposed subject, the novelist.
Because, you know, when I was growing up, there was a sentence in our Latin classes 100 years ago, which was de gustibus non disputandum est, of tastes you don't discuss. And it seemed to me always that the most interesting part of our life was to discuss and debate tastes.
Yes.
But when your taste changes, is changing your taste the same thing as changing your mind?
Yes, because I think all tastes are expressions of belief. I'm about to choke, sorry. I'm going to have to stop singing, like coughing so badly. You know, each novel I've written, any novel that anybody writes, it's not that you sit down saying, I believe this and now I will write this, but just by the nature of your sentences, just by the things you emphasize or don't emphasize, you're constantly expressing a belief about the way you think the world is, about the things you think are important. And those things change. They do change. And the form of the novel changes as well. A very simple example is in a lot of my fiction, I've delved very deeply into people's heads, into their consciousness, and kind of tried to take out every detail. The older I get, the more I meet people and realize I don't know them. My own husband is a stranger to me, really, fundamentally at the end. You don't know these people. That should be reflected in what you write, that total knowledge is impossible. You're going to have to leave and choke backstage.
Total knowledge is impossible. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Me, myself, and I.
Few questions, if you'd like. So we'll bring up a mic.
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
I had to.
Sorry.
Poor thing.
Thank you. No, but thank you.
Yeah, have the kind you like.
Oh, I'll take this first, and then we'll move on. Just a few. Don't worry, I won't be long-winded.
Come up to the mic, if you would.
for a minute to the whole question of the Facebook and so forth and so on. I was talking about that with somebody, and they used a word I had never heard before, and it was different. And, and I was wondering, do you have any ideas like that about the effect that these new technologies have on creating neologisms beyond the technical neologisms, but like different emotional neologisms?
I have to admit that I quite like the neologisms that technology creates, and I find defriend a really useful one. I quite often in the real world think I must defriend that person. But again, the difference in the real world is that defriending should be it needs to be a proper process. You need to have the conversation, and the internet makes it a little easy to defriend the people you want to defriend. Anything that makes new words, I know that you're meant to find them barbaristic, but I kind of love them. That's the bit of the internet I love most, is the word creation, half of which I don't understand, particularly the acronyms, but I kind of love that that's happening. That to me is the creative part of the internet. That's kind of terrific. Toure, you're not serious.
I mean, I'm a journalist, so I have to have a question.
Hello.
Right? But from the piece, the New York Review piece, just talk about what it means to be a person 1.0 versus person 2.0, and at your age, it must be a bit of a struggle to not become a person 2.0.
I have to be honest, I don't know, because I am opting out. I can see it happening. As each new platform happens, I shrink back into my old ways. So I really feel that when I was writing the piece, that was my point of commentary. From now on, I'll be completely invalidated. I won't be able to comment because I won't know. But just from what I see, I do think that my friends who are heavily involved with it, there does seem to be an inverse relation between the capacity for intimacy and the kind of self-revelation that goes on online. In a very basic way, the inability to form eye contact, kind of nervousness in person, and the wish always to text rather than phone, all that kind of stuff. Those kind of minor ways of being, of relating to someone. But it might be that those relations are a way the world's going to operate, you know? But the thing which I do find exhausting as a person 1.0 is the amount of time everything takes. It's easy to remember that 15 years ago, that email thing that we're doing, that time weren't doing that, you know? So
how are we functioning?
Well, it's interesting because thinking about seeing that Virginia Woolf manuscript upstairs, I do remember from the diaries and letters that she's writing about 20 notes a day, right? Someone comes and picks them up and takes them down the street and puts them all over London. That's about the same as email, right? It's not so different, though her notes would tend to be shorter, I guess. But the amount of time that I have to give to this self-admin, I just don't think in 1994 I had this thing in my life called self-admin that takes hours. And that seems a bit scary to me, self-generated, unnecessary email. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
First, thank you so much for mentioning George Saunders.
Ah.
I love him.
Yeah, I love him too.
He's so great. The article was wonderful. I sent it off to other people whose then young son wrote back and said at the beginning he knew there was something wrong with it. He was about 16 when he went on it. And he started making fake like groups. And he said there was something about people just trying to celebrate the normal things of life. He made a group where if he turned the light on in the bathroom, sometimes he would forget. So then he'd go to the bathroom and then he'd turn it off. Do you like this? And he said lots of people were doing that. Were becoming part of his like group. Wow. Are you like me? Do you turn the light on or off when you leave the bathroom? One of the main things that I think it can be used for, after you're reading your article, I know two people. One severely emotionally damaged, another one definitely Asperger's. They're having a great time. The damaged one said that because of the family situation, she's been able to go into the little, I don't know what it is, farmland, house land, whatever it is, and she can sit on the couch in the living room with her severely damaged sister and herself and talk about the family problems. It's fascinating. She can't talk to her in person. They can't get along. And it's interesting that it has aspects to it that normal people who have friends and can talk and write, we don't like it. It's creepy.
I think those
but there are
thin
people that are
relations-
getting a lot of
But I think those
access
thin
on it.
relations can be useful. You know, the same with the TV. It's not that you go to TV for everything you need, but it's also sometimes useful to have on in the back of Thanksgiving when you're about to kill your aunt. So I don't think that those thin relations are evil. It's just that you worry that they become the only thing and that you forget that there were other ways of relating to people. But everybody knows that there are some certain people you'd rather text than talk to. There is a criteria of person you just really don't want to talk to. A text is just good enough. So I don't think that's an inherently evil relation. It's just it's the idea of it as the way we should relate, and the way Zuckerberg talks about it as a philosophy, that slightly unnerved me. Yeah.
Let's take a couple more questions.
Hi, Ms. Smith. I bunked work in Washington, D.C. to be with you here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My question is relation to empathy and your article that you wrote about the social network. What does empathy do for the art of writing the novel? Does it change that? What does Facebook, and does that reduce empathy, and does that reduce our innate ability to be in other places or imagine other?
No, it just might be that the novel as we've known it, or the way that Eliot wrote it, that novel just changes into something else. I'd love to read a novel which managed to capture truly the texture of our lives now, which are a great deal of them spent online. Like to me, the responsibility of a novel is to try and be honest to the times it exists in. So it will change the form of a novel, but that's a good thing. The novel can't stay at the same place forever. It can't have the same beliefs that Eliot had forever, because people aren't that way anymore. And that's okay, I think. Hey.
The conversation reminded me of another Foster Wallace essay, which is the E Pluribus Unum one, where he talks about television. And it seems like one of the insights from that applies to the internet conversation, which is that it's not that it's inherently bad, it's actually extremely good at what it does, and that it's just easy, and that the real issue is its easiness. And in some ways, that seems to parallel with what's going on with reading right now, where reading's job is increasingly to convince people that a harder medium, a process, as you said, is the way that they want to absorb life lessons and information and so forth, and reading is now a niche process tool. And I was wondering, you just said that the novel should evolve. Do you think about how it could be, I don't know, easier? I know it's almost a bad word, but...
I think the reason why novelists are attracted to difficulty, or the reason someone like Wallace was, is because he's trying to slow you down, really. That's really what it's about. He's trying for you not to process what's coming at you in the same way you would process TV or the internet when it's easy. It's not always easy, the internet. But the job of the novel has always been to try and slow you down and be attentive to this thing. And all Wallace was trying to say is that job has become a little harder. I have to slow you down in different ways because you're such a great media consumer that I really have to go around the houses to make you stop and think. And so I think that's why the novel is attracted to complexity, and maybe that is annoying to a lot of people, but I really feel with so much that's easily consumed, can't we have this little corner which is occasionally a bit difficult? It's not going to be the end of the world, is it? And nobody's forcing them on anyone. If it ends up being a small community who are interested in that kind of complexity, that's okay.
The way there was a movement for slow food, there should be a movement for slow reading.
Well, exactly. It's just a different way of being in the world. It doesn't seem to me a bad one. One more, I guess. People have to go eat and stuff. Yeah.
I have a question I'd like to ask you with the aim of sort of demystifying the process of writing. Coming from a former NYU creative writing student, actually. But I'm curious, when you sit down to write a novel, how fully fleshed out is your idea for the book? Do you know each character intimately? Do you know each location, each step?
No.
It's just a matter of organizing it?
Not at all. And just upstairs when we were looking at To the Lighthouse, Woolf, I already knew this about Woolf because I've seen other manuscripts, but she will have, like, for each chapter, a word, pretty much, maybe two. And what she's trying to get at is a sensation. And she's made a little edit for herself under one page saying, I see I used to be, start loose and get tighter, where now I always start tight and get loose. That means something to me immediately. I don't know whether it means something to you. But that is the way that novelists really talk to each other. And that's why in a creative writing class like you've been in, like I'm in, there's so much dishonesty, because it's very hard to say to 12 kids, how about if you start loose and get tighter? But that's the truth. That's how writers really think about their work, in that completely random, stupid way. It sounds stupid, but it's something you do with your gut. And it happens sentence by sentence. So a character is barely in my mind until I get to it, and then I start making the sentences. But I make absolutely no extensive plans. I have an idea of a sensibility and a color, and whether it's going to be loose or tight, literally.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.